afternoon. I got into Bitcoin very early. I was 9 years old. I was 9 years old when I got into Bitcoin. I've grown quickly. When I was 9 years old, for 2 years, between the ages of 9 and 11, I had to help my family out. I come from a family who have a terrible gene which causes them to be troublemakers everywhere they go. And my family were living in apartheid South Africa, and we were fighting against the apartheid regime, and we were deemed as a result by the apartheid government to be troublemakers. And so we suddenly realized that we had to get our money out of the country quickly. But South Africa, like many countries, even today, had very significant capital controls. And so the way that we had to get our money out was to smuggle it. And I was the oldest son, and so what my mother did is she bought Kruger rands, which are these little gold coins that the South African government minted, and she bought me this very, very stupidly thick winter jacket because we were growing up in Africa. And she sewed these gold coins into my winter jacket, and I would have to go through airport security wearing my jacket in the middle of summer and getting very weird looks. I was a weird kid, so that was usual. And we did this for 2 years, and eventually we got the funds out of the country, and we managed to leave South Africa. And we had other family who had to leave more immediately, and we did the same thing over that 2-year period for their money as well. Now, as a result, when in 2011 I was reading about Bitcoin for the first time, 3 things happened. First is that I spilt my coffee all over my laptop. The second is I jumped up and I said, buy! And I emailed everyone I knew to buy Bitcoins. And then the third thing that I realized pretty quickly afterwards is that they, and by they I meant the government, are going to try and kill this. And so for the last 2 years, in 3 key ways, I've been involved in what I think is the unglamorous work of trying to make the world safe for Bitcoin from regulators. And I'll tell you about those 3 ways in a bit. But before that, I'd like to deal with 3 key myths around Bitcoin. One thing that I hear people talk about Bitcoin all the time is they say Bitcoin is going to have a binary outcome. It's either going to go to 0 or it's going to go to 700 bazillion quadrillion. And nothing could be further from the truth. Even though the smartest people, the smartest VCs and the smartest people in the industry keep on repeating this, is completely untrue. And the major reason that's untrue is because not only is there a good chance that Bitcoin could fluctuate anywhere between those 2 things, but individual Bitcoins could be worth very, very distinct and different amounts of money. And this is a huge danger that very few people have been discussing up until now. Over the last 2 days, the discussion has exploded on this because of a company that have announced that they're going to try and make this happen. And the way they're trying to make this happen is by taking advantage of myth number 2, which is that Bitcoin transactions are anonymous and that Bitcoin is anonymous. The truth of the matter is that every single Bitcoin, by design, every single Bitcoin transaction by design is tracked by the entire world. All of those 80,000 nodes that were downloaded in China are tracking every single transaction that is happening all around the world. And so Yifu Guo, who was and continues to be a major producer of Bitcoin mining equipment, recently joined with several other people, and yesterday they announced, I don't know if it was yesterday, I'm terribly jet lagged, but within the last 48 hours they announced that they're starting a company to greenlight, to create a whitelist of Bitcoins. So the idea here is that we track Bitcoins, and then we can say this Bitcoin has never been involved in a crime, or this Bitcoin has never been stolen, or this Bitcoin, we know where it came from, and so it's safe to transact in these Bitcoins. Now, for someone who's involved in mining, has a huge obvious advantage, right? Because when you're mining, you're creating these virgin coins, and like virgins, they're pure as the driven snow. And so it's easy to show that they've never been involved in a crime. And in fact, if you're a large miner, it's easy for you to register with the authorities, and as a result, your coins become more valuable than other coins. Now, this to a currency is death. because the whole point of a currency is fungibility, or what people have started calling Bitcoin neutrality. So it's a very significant danger to Bitcoin, and something I'll address in a moment. And it ties into another myth that we've heard today many times, which is that Bitcoin can't be stopped. So for example, in the discussion in China, it was said that Bitcoin would be very difficult to stop because there's no central authority that you can put your thumb under. But imagine you're living in China and you want to get hold of Bitcoins. How do you do it? How would you do it? You would have to buy Bitcoins, because it's impossible to mine Bitcoins today if you're a regular individual. Unless you have a huge mining infrastructure, you're not going to mine Bitcoins. It's just too difficult. If you have a huge mining infrastructure, it's very hard to hide it. It's not something you're going to keep in a closet, it's something that you're going to have an entire warehouse for. So you can't hide Bitcoin mining anymore. And the other option is to buy Bitcoins. And the key way that Bitcoins are bought today are in central exchanges, for example, BTC China. So Bitcoin, despite its decentralized nature from a technological perspective, from a human perspective, is highly centralized today. And so there are substantial regulatory threats to Bitcoin, and these threats are going to get substantially more acute over time. And so the question is, how can we deal with this? Because Bitcoin is truly a revolutionary technology. And we want to see its potential, both in terms of reducing the cost of transactions, in terms of allowing people in tyrannical regimes to perform transactions. One of the groups that I'm working with now are using Bitcoin in order to fund civil rights movements in countries where it's impossible to get money to them. So how can we encourage these things? So I've been involved in 3 key initiatives to try and make sure that the good side of Bitcoin is emphasized and that the good side of Bitcoin is not crushed. The first of these is my company. Our company is called Epiphyte, and what we've been doing is we've been creating a network of banking relationships, regulatory compliance and licensing, compliance officers, and back office systems in countries around the world. The idea basically is this. Every single country at the moment has a different regulatory regime when it comes to Bitcoin, or really anything. That's what makes them countries. So for any particular company, even if it's a large company, to go into every single country individually is massively expensive. It's price prohibitive. And so only the largest banks, as was mentioned a moment ago, can really afford to do this. And if Bitcoin becomes so expensive to deal with from a company point of view, it's going to be expensive from the end user point of view. The microtransaction, for example, will not be possible because there are going to be all of these transaction costs. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to act as a centralized and globalized back office for Bitcoin companies so that even small Bitcoin companies without upfront investment could go and introduce themselves into markets across the world. We've been working with regulators in various countries, primarily focused in Central and South America, Southern Africa, and the Middle East. And we're starting our first pilot project in 2 weeks' time in Israel. And we're looking for additional partners in countries around the world, and that's one of the reasons I'm here in Singapore. The second initiative that I've been involved in, and probably the one I'm best known for, because of a YouTube video that went semi-viral from the conference in San Jose 8 months ago, is for the last year and a half I've been involved with the government of Honduras and several other governments in West Africa and Central America to build out new kinds of free trade zones. So countries around the world have seen that free trade zones did miracles for Hong Kong, for Shenzhen, for Shanghai. They look at Singapore as a model city, the city of the future, and they say, how can we do this for ourselves? And the answer is they can't, because Hong Kong and Shenzhen and Shanghai already exist, and that cheap labor model of building yourself up has become much more difficult than it was in the 1950s and 1960s. And so we've been helping countries realize a new vision of what a free trade zone could be. And we've been working primarily recently with the Honduran government. So some of you may have heard that there was this massive project in Honduras to create free charter cities, which would have their own rules or would have the laws of Canada in Honduras or various other things. It became quite well known. It was published in multiple journals. Everyone said it was a terrible idea. Then the Supreme Court in Honduras deliberated about it, and we had worked for around a year to change the constitution in Honduras to facilitate this, and the Supreme Court in Honduras came in and they said no. No. So everyone thought it was dead, including us. And we went into stealth mode, but we went back into Honduras and we've continued working with them. And since then, we've managed to change the constitution in Honduras again. We've now been through an initial vetting by the Supreme Court. We've also managed to get through legislation, which is the executive legislation, to create the first of these zones. 5 weeks ago, the government of Honduras appointed the first members of the Executive Council that will be creating the first of these zones. At the end of this month, there are going to be elections in Honduras, after which we will be able to continue with the project. And in fact, I'm happy to say we now expect that the first of these zones will be incorporated in March or April of this coming year. We're starting small. The first zones are going to be existing cities which are already incorporated, which will now be able to incorporate under their own law. But what's interesting here is that the whole project has been set up that any area in Honduras can incorporate under their own legal system, which they can create themselves, which could be run by a for-profit organization, with the goal of creating competitive governance. In other words, if you have a zone, you no longer have monopoly over the people living in that zone, because those people could leave and go to the next zone. The idea is to change the paradigm from a government and citizens to a service provider and customers, and force through this government to be much more sensitive to the needs of customers. And one of the key things that we're doing here is we're also working with these groups to introduce legislation which would for the first time create regulatory certainty around Bitcoin. And let me pause for a moment on what I mean by regulatory certainty. So Singapore today is one of the best places in the world to start a business dealing with Bitcoin, because the government of Singapore have come and said, we at the moment do not intend to legislate Bitcoin. So is this good news? On a scale of 0 to 10, I would say, eh. And why eh? Because what that tells you is now you can build a company, but you're going to find it hard to convince people to invest multi-millions of dollars in that company, which is today what is required for most typical tech startups, because what they've said is not that we think that Bitcoin is fine, it's just that we're going to be lazy about regulating it. Regulatory certainty, on the other hand, is when we come and say, these are the definitive laws around how we intend to deal with Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies or distributed technologies, and this is the way it's going to be. When my formal education, I was doing a PhD, which I never completed because I was like the government of Singapore, which is to say lazy in that respect. But one of the experiments we did is we needed to create a paradigm so that we could test drugs for bipolar disease. So how do you create bipolar disease in rats? We would feed them food and teach them to press a lever. So that they would receive pellets of food every time they pressed the lever, except that randomly we would also electrocute them. So there were rats who we electrocuted every single time, and they were fine. They were like, okay, I understand, I'm not going to eat. And so, or if we only fed them through electrocution, they accepted it. They would accept the shock and move on with their lives. But the rats who we electrocuted only sometimes, they were hysterical. They would run up and down. They were drooling all the time. They couldn't take the pressure because they didn't know if this time they were going to get electrocuted. Those are the Bitcoin companies of today. So that's a second. Thank you. That's the second initiative I'm involved in. And the third initiative I'm involved in is DATA, which is the Digital Asset Transfer Authority, which is an international self-regulatory body that we've created. It's currently, we currently have 25 of some of the largest companies in the Bitcoin space involved. So that's BitInstant and Circle, who recently got funded for $9 million, and TradeHill and Ripple Labs and BitInstant and Paywood, et cetera, my company included. And what we're seeking to do is we're seeking to create best practices which can be globalized. So create a set of regulations which we expect all of our members to adhere to and which we can suggest to regulators around the world about how best to protect consumers. Just over the last 2 weeks, something like $10 million was stolen from Bitcoin exchanges. One in Australia, and the other one was GBL in China. So that's a lot of money, and that reflects poorly on the entire industry. So we're creating best practices and a self-auditing process for consumer protection. Which means that you no longer have to just rely on brands. You will now be able, as a Bitcoin consumer, to go onto any site and see whether or not the site has been audited by Data, is a member of Data, and to know whether or not you're likely to be safe placing your money there. The second thing that we're doing is we're spending a lot of time and money working with regulators and trying to educate them on the benefits of Bitcoin. Now, there's a two-pronged strategy here. One is we feel like if there's a regulatory vacuum, then regulators are going to want to fill that vacuum, because as you know, regulators abhor a vacuum. The second thing is that even if we can't make sure that the regulation that eventually holds for Bitcoin is only our proposed or self-regulation, we can at least propose an alternative which is worth debating and extend the conversation long enough to allow the industry to flourish in the meantime. So the third thing that we're doing as a result is also spending a lot of time talking to regulators, lobbying not only the regulators but also the banks and the other influencers who are likely to influence the decisions that regulators eventually make, and partnering with them. And we've actually received very good reception in these three things. And so one of the things I'd like to encourage you to think about, today the majority of the companies that are members of Data are US companies. They have this, saying, they say, "We are anonymous, expect us." Well, my expectation is you could imagine regulators saying the same thing. "We are regulators, expect us." And they're coming. They're coming, and we need to prepare for that. So the efforts that you've heard today are important, and I encourage all of you to consider joining Data. But I find that, and also those of you who are looking for a place of incorporation, hopefully in April we will be able to offer the first place in the world with actual regulatory certainty about this. So what I typically find in talks like this is that the best way to get this information across is through questions. And so what I'd like to try and do is, at this point, open the floor up to questions, and I'd be happy to talk about any one of those three initiatives, so Epiphyte, Data, or the Honduras project.
Hello. Yeah. First of all, brilliant talk, brilliant effort. I've been following Honduras project for years. I also, as you thought it was dead after the Supreme Court struck it down, I was relieved to read a few months ago in Reason that it actually is still alive. So happy for you, and do the job, great job. I wanted to ask you, what's the monetary framework you are considering for these cities when you advise them? Are any of them considering the Austrian concept of free banking, competing currencies, a minimum regulatory environment for banks and for institutions, or so do they plan to peg to dollar or something like that?
The short answer is yes. It's something we've discussed extensively about actually having a free banking system. So for those of you who may be unfamiliar with it, today when people think of money in a country or in a legal zone, it's always backed by a central bank. In other words, they're the ones who get to decide how much money is created. But that wasn't always the case. In some of the most successful economies of the 1800s, and early 1900s, what actually happened was that any bank was able to create their own banknotes. That's why they're called banknotes. And those circulated freely and competed amongst themselves in the economy. There were problems with it, but interestingly enough, almost all of those problems have been solved through digitization. The major problem was that if the bank that issued the currency was far away, then the currency tended to fall in value as a proportion of its distance from the bank. But digitization solves that problem, and so I think the time is ripe for allowing the free market to once again experiment, as it does so well, with creating better forms of managing money, and potentially, as a result, mitigating things like the bubbles and crashes that we've been experiencing since, well, for the last 100 years. I'll go a little bit further and say I wouldn't expect the first two zones to have this. The first two zones are going to be fairly conservative, which I think is a smart decision by the government of Honduras. We don't want to... my experience in working with all fields of regulation is that baby steps will get you to the end goal faster than giant leaps. But yes, there are definitely groups that are already working on plans like this, and I think you'll see them introduced over the coming 2 years. Yes, sir.
I was just wondering if you guys are working with any other jurisdictions, any other countries.
Yes, we're in active talks with numerous jurisdictions. I have actually reduced my involvement in that over the last 6 months as I've ramped up my involvement in Bitcoin. But we've been actively in talks with governments in West Africa. We've been actively speaking to, and in fact we'll be putting together a proposal for a pan-Central American program which would be based on the Honduran model. And there's also been interest in other South American countries. Yes, please.
I haven't heard about the Honduras strategy you're talking about. How do you go about approaching a government and say to them, you know, it would be a really good idea, you should have competition among your policies and you should be multiple?
That's a good question. A lot of the credit goes to a gentleman by the name of Mark Klugman when it comes to Honduras. He used to be a speechwriter for Reagan, and he spent 20 years acting as a advisor to various Central American governments. And over this period of time, he slowly baby-stepped them into thinking about these projects. At the same time, in Honduras in particular, he got lucky because a number of people who managed to get into government. The government of Honduras actually is full of very, very capable people. This happens on occasion with democracy. So it's full of very, very capable people who realized that they couldn't change Honduras from within, but by creating small little models in much the same way that China did, they potentially could create aspirational goals for the rest of the country. And by adding the ability for any group of citizens to declare themselves a zone, they saw how this could eventually become the rule of law throughout Honduras.
Right. Thank you very much, Edan. That's all the time we have for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.